where some important places are. The bathrooms are out the center door and to the right if you need them. And just walk around, see what else you want over here. I want to start us off because we're needing to launch this thing that we believe the Holy Spirit has called us to just take a moment to kind of open us in prayer. So I invite you to pray with me. Gracious God, for this time together, we give you thanks. We ask, Lord, that you would make your presence known here with us. Would you maybe open our eyes and ears and hearts to see and hear and know that you are here in a way that we might have missed earlier, Lord. Bless our speaker tonight. Take care of our conversations. Lord, we pray for a holy excitement to fill this space as we prepare to become a place that provides rest for both caregivers and their loved ones, Lord, as well as a place of excitement and passion and of your Spirit's presence for those of us who serve. So, Lord, enjoy this time together. May it be a sweet-smelling offering to you. We ask all this in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kenyetta Hardy, and I am the Director of Congregational Care and Connections here at Scioto Ridge United Methodist Church. I am also the director of a new amazing respite ministry here called Renew, Refresh, Restore. On behalf of Scioto Ridge United Methodist Church and Renew, Refresh, Restore, I extend a warm welcome to all of you gathered here in person and online. We are here for a very important cause: to support the caregiver and raise awareness and share knowledge about Alzheimer's disease, a condition that profoundly affects individuals, families, and our community. Before I go any further, I want to publicly recognize my team and say thank you to Karen Hartman, Jody Yano, Dave Hallman, and Deborah Stoner. Would you help me and celebrate my team, please? This team has been very instrumental in assisting me with getting this program off the ground. They will be available after the meeting for registration, whether you come as a volunteer or wanting to register your loved one as a participant. There are a couple of community leaders I would like to acknowledge. I'm not sure if they're here in the sanctuary or they may be watching online. I would like to thank Grant Ames and Lynn Dobbs, both from the Central Ohio Area Agency on Aging, Pam Myers at the Alzheimer's Association of Northwest and Central Ohio. I thank you for all of your support and the answers to the mirage of questions that I had and will have in the future. Connecting with each of you has been God-sent, and I'm looking forward to a continuous working relationship with you. Thank you to Brad Aycock and the Fresh Starts Ministry of West Ohio Conference of the United Methodist Church. Before this respite ministry had a name, we were awarded our very first grant. For that, we are very grateful. Many thanks to Daphne Johnston, the CEO for Respite for All in Montgomery, Alabama. We were awarded our second grant from this organization and a detailed blueprint to follow, so we did not have to reinvent the wheel. Earlier this week, I was given some good information or exciting information about an anonymous monetary donor. When I was told about how the funds would be used, I teared up. I'm a crybaby anyway, but it was an answer to a prayer that I had on my heart. Excuse me. Since the beginning of this program, I want to say to that donor, you are a true testament that God is faithful. And all we need to do is to have faith and watch God manifest. Thank you for your generosity. Alzheimer's is more than just a medical diagnosis. It is a journey that changes the lives of millions around the world. Today, we come together not only to learn about the latest developments in research and treatment, but to support each other as a community. By sharing information, experiences, and resources, we can better understand this complex condition and how it affects our loved ones. This evening, we will hear from Renee Kovesci, pronounced it right. She is a nurse practitioner in cognitive neurology at Ohio State University. Renee will give us an overview of cognitive impairment and talk more in depth about Alzheimer's. Then we will hear from the senior pastor of Scioto Ridge United Methodist Church, Reverend Dr. Jason Wellman, as he conveys to us how Alzheimer's and spirituality coexist. I need to stop and say, Jason, thank you for your trust in seeing something in me to lead this ministry. I normally joke with you about how you continuously push me out of my comfort zone, but I have come to realize it's more of the fine print that is on my job description, all other duties as required. Thank you for being such a supportive and encouraging leader. Now I encourage each of you to listen intently, ask questions, and connect with us and one another. Once again, thank you all for being here. Together, we can bring hope and strength to those affected by this challenging condition. Please help me welcome to the stage Renee Kovesci.
Hello, and I have my slides on my phone because I don't know that I'll be able to read them back there, but we'll work together. My eyesight. So I thank you, Kenyetta, for that. And, you know, I'm so excited about the program that you all have developed here and what it means. And it's really a passion of mine to see communities come together and support one another. And in the world of cognitive impairment and dementia, very often folks are very isolated. And so to see something from the grassroots of, communities supporting one another is just really, really important. And I hope to see this kind of program replicated elsewhere. So with that being said, as she said, I am a nurse practitioner at Ohio State. I have been with the Department of Neurology for 15 years. A lot of what I do is research in the areas of dementia and Alzheimer's and caregiver stress and burden. And so I love coming out into the community and teaching and educating and hoping to change some of the stigmas around this condition. So objectives for tonight's talk. We're going to learn a little bit about dementia and cognitive impairment diagnosis and what that means. We will learn about common behaviors that we see. We're going to learn a little bit about medications that we use and some of the new medications, and then a little bit about current research. And so, these are, in each of those, I could probably talk for 2 hours on each bullet point. So this is a very surface, level stuff here, but I think it'll give you a good overview, and certainly I'm available afterwards for some questions as well. With a group this size, I usually try to hold questions for the end just so we kind of stay on target. So let's talk a little bit about progression of cognitive impairment. So, we have what's considered normal, and that's a little bit different from one person to the next and what that means. The next stage of change is perhaps what we call mild cognitive impairment and then dementia. And I'll go into a little more detail about what those terms mean. But the reason I put this up in kind of a visual is that there's kind of these little bits of overlap, and this is a little bit of it's not very black and white. There's some gray to this. So when we talk about what is cognitive impairment, mild cognitive impairment, What that means is the person is having some thinking and memory issues that either they themselves are noticing or maybe the people around them are noticing. They're not so significant that they're impacting their ability to function day to day. So, they were what we call inefficient. Oh, you can move to the next slide. We call them inefficiencies. So you're still able to get by, you're still able to do the same things that you've always done, you just may take a little bit longer, you may need some memory reminders or keeping a list or, maybe attending a little bit more to your calendar than you have in the past. So you have these thinking and memory issues, but by and large, you're still independently able to get through your day. So not all patients with mild cognitive impairment will progress on to a dementia. Some do and some don't. It sort of depends on what's the underlying cause of that cognitive impairment. So next slide, we talk about then what is dementia. So the difference between mild cognitive impairment and dementia is really a person's functional ability. So at this point now we're relying a little bit more on friends or family or spouses or children, and we're needing help paying the bills. We're needing help maybe with our medications. We're needing help, maybe we're not driving as safely as we have in the past. Cooking is going downhill. We're shopping lists are getting a little bizarre, or we're buying things that we don't really need. So we're needing more, the impairments, the changes that folks are seeing are severe enough that they're interfering with daily functioning. So they need somebody else around kind of helping them a little bit. I knew that was gonna happen. I was gonna talk too long and my phone's not gonna recognize me. There we go. All right. Next slide. So when we talk about dementia, oftentimes the term dementia and Alzheimer's disease are used interchangeably, and that's really not the case. There's a lot of similarities, but it's not quite the way it works. So dementia is an umbrella term. Again, the definition of dementia is you're having thinking and memory problems that are bad enough that they're impacting your day-to-day functioning. The term Alzheimer's disease falls under that umbrella. So there's lots of different types or causes of dementia. By and large, the most common is Alzheimer's disease. We think it accounts for about 60 to 80% of dementia diagnoses. So, but other things that can cause thinking and memory issues in dementia can be dementia with Lewy bodies, frontotemporal dementia. These are a little less common than Alzheimer's. Vascular dementia, that can be folks that have had either a large stroke that they're well aware of, or sometimes folks with more small strokes that we don't even necessarily know until we look at on an MRI scan or a CT scan. Oftentimes there's multiple causes of the dementia, but we're finding out more and more that patients oftentimes have Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia, and we don't always know that until we autopsy a brain after somebody passes away. So we know there's a lot of folks that have what we call co-pathologies, so they've got kind of multiple things going on in the brain. Many of these dementias are caused by various proteins that build up in the brain, and Alzheimer's disease is caused by amyloid and tau, which are two separate proteins that build up in the brain and kind of impact the brain cells' abilities to function. And so similarly, Lewy body dementia is caused by a different protein called alpha-synuclein. There's lots of different proteins that can potentially cause frontotemporal dementia. So we don't know entirely why one person ends up with a whole bunch of these proteins and other people don't, or why are some people maybe better at getting rid of these proteins than others. So lots and lots of research around that. But essentially with most of these neurodegenerative dementias, there's some sort of bad protein building up in your brain that is causing brain cells to not work properly and eventually die. And then as they die, you get kind of shrinkage of that actual brain matter. Well, this is going to be a pain. There we go. So one of the things I want to talk about, we can move to the next slide, is some behavioral stuff. So one of the main challenges a lot of times for folks who are caregivers and for the patients themselves as well are some of the behavioral changes that we see that are commonly affiliated with cognitive impairment. So what you have to think about is that cognitive impairment causes actual physical and structural changes in the brain. There's chemical changes that go on in the brain. And so it's sort of like, if you're having liver failure, you can expect to see some symptoms from that. You might get yellow and jaundice, you might have dry, flaky skin, some of these things. And so when your brain cells are changing and not working as well and dying off, it's not uncommon to see some of these changes in how you think and how your personality and how you present yourself. Not all people with cognitive impairment will develop behavioral changes. Some people have very mild things that change. Some people have very severe changes. Next slide. And the severity of those dementia behaviors depends on multiple things. It can depend on the type of dementia. So we know that folks with behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia will get very extreme behavioral changes from their baseline. They become sometimes very angry and agitated or very hyper-fixated on things. They can become very repetitive and obsessive when that was never really their interest, or that was never really their personality before. Lewy body dementia, for example, tends to have a lot of hallucinations visually, where they're seeing and hearing people or animals or children that are not usually there. It's not to say that you can't get those things in these other types of dementia, but the type of dementia does somewhat, give us a little bit of a predictability about what type of behavioral changes you might see. The previous personality of the patient is probably one of the biggest factors. Like I said, with frontotemporal dementia behavioral variant, we often see a very big shift in behaviors, completely different personality. But for the most part, with the other types of dementia, a lot of times the behavioral changes you see are kind of the patient's previous personality just kind of amplified. So, if I have a patient who's really agitated and angry and irritable and upset, a lot of times I'll ask families, tell me a little bit about, what he was like 20 years ago. And people, wife will say, well, he's always been kind of a jerk, or, he was never super friendly, or, and so it's those same things kind of amplified. Or maybe she was always a busybody and she kept, the house was neat and tidy at all times and she always liked to keep busy. Well, now she can't sit down because she's always trying to clean, or she's fiddling, or she was never one to sit and watch TV for an hour. So a lot of times we look at those previous personalities and see that this is the manifestation of who they've always been. It's just kind of to a whole new level. One of the big things that impacts behavior changes is the caregiver's approach, and subsequently the environment of the patient. And so a lot of times we don't realize as caregivers how much our stress, our mood, our attitude, our reactions to the patient, how much that is impacting their behavior and their reaction. I often say, and it's probably on one of my slides, we can't change the patient that much. There's certainly some little tweaks we can do with medications and things, but what we do have kind of control over as caregivers is how we react and respond to the patient. And so I always like to say, if they say the sky is green, we say, oh, that's lovely. I haven't seen it that color in a while. Instead of saying, of course it's not green, Dad, it's blue. Why would you say it's green? That's not physically, that's not possible, And so a lot of times caregivers inadvertently are creating and worsening some of the behaviors. And, it's very easy to say, but I often tell folks, when your stress level is at a 10, every little thing that person says or does is going to drive you bonkers. And I equate it to a stay-at-home mom with 4 kids, and her husband gets home at 5:30, 6 o'clock, and she's like, I've had it. You deal with these kids. I'm going to go take a hot bath. And the dad looks at him and he's like, well, they're not doing anything wrong, but he hasn't been there with it all day long. And so that is one of the main wonderful values of a program like what you guys are developing, is we need breaks as caregivers. We need to find ways to reduce our stress, because it really is, as much as it's for the caregiver, it's also for the patient, because you're going to be a lot more tolerant when they ask you the same question 20 times. If you know that you're bringing them to respite at 10 a.m., you can get through it a little bit easier than if you know you've got all day to deal with that same question over and over again. So caregiver stress, caregiver respite, all of these things are very, very important from the behavioral management standpoint, probably far more important in a lot of ways than medications and some of the things that we talk about in the more pharmaceutical standpoint. So next slide. Some of my, sometimes the behaviors that patients are experiencing are really their way of kind of explaining or communicating that they've got an unmet need. And certainly some of these things manifest a little bit more in the moderate to severe stages of these diseases. But a lot of times patients may be hungry or thirsty or tired, or they need to use the restroom. They may be too hot or too cold. They may be in pain, and their brain isn't able to connect the dots to say, this is what's making me angry, or this is what's making me upset, is that I've got all of these things going on. Sometimes when they're bored, they're, again, that person who was always busy and active and doing things, if they don't really have anything to do, sometimes that can stimulate some irritability and agitation type stuff. Next slide. So some of my caregiver tips are you really do need to become a detective and kind of try to figure out, what's leading up to some of these things. If we have these kind of episodic, big episodes of agitation or upset, let's, get through it, but then let's be reflective and think back on what was it that we were, had 4 different things planned one morning and it was just way too much. Or maybe around the holidays, this is a common thing we see in the clinic, is that, we take mom and we go to my sister's house and we have Christmas and there's 50 people there, and we just, this is what we do every year. And, mom was so nasty and mean, she even yelled at my granddaughter, and, she never would have done that. Well, that's a lot of stimulation. That's a lot of going ons that it's just overwhelming for their brain. So trying to be that detective and think back, what happened before? Did I set her up for success, or did I sort of set her up for an episode, right? So again, we talk about trying to accommodate the behavior and not control the behavior. So let's try to think ahead as best as we can. Again, we cannot change the person, but we can change how we react to the person. And we can change some of their physical environment. So if your husband has always loved going to Applebee's, it's his favorite restaurant, you can still go, but you may not want to go at 6 o'clock on a Saturday, maybe go at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday. Oftentimes folks with cognitive impairment and dementia, their brains get very easily overstimulated. And so, from a sensory input, we're constantly hearing and seeing and feeling. Right now my hands are feeling a little bit chilly. I hear a little bit of a fan back here, but my brain kind of zones all of that out so that I can focus on you. When you get these cognitive impairments, the brain sort of is like taking in all of these different stimulus and is like, I don't know which one's the most important. And so you oftentimes will get them either sort of shutting down and not participating in conversations, or, just, I want to go home, I'm done, let's get out of here, and you've only been there 20 minutes. So again, their physical environment can be, very either detrimental or very helpful from a behavioral standpoint. So your 5 best friends when it comes to being a caregiver are flexibility, creativity, patience. And I am not a patient person, so I get it. Like, it does not come natural, really, to most of us, I think. Compassion, humor, really try to focus on your own behavior and how you can kind of alter things a little bit. And again, when your stress is at a 10, it's hard to change these things. The other part is, when it's been your wife of 50 years, the way you respond is just sort of ingrained, and you're going, what? Why would you say that? And it's just because this is the way we've always reacted to one another. I had a patient's husband tell me one time that he's bitten his tongue so much that he's now chewed it off and there's nothing left. But that really does have to be you gotta kind of take that pause before you just let it out. Nope, I'm not gonna do it that way this time. Next slide. So some communication tips. A positive mood can go a long way. And again, it's a lot easier to be in a positive mood when you're not stressed out to your max. Getting their attention is important. Again, when you think about all the different stimulus coming in, a lot of times I'll have, and I put myself in this category of kind of this like nagging wife complex of when, the wife will say, I tell him to do something and, he just doesn't do it, or he does half of it or whatnot. Well, it's like if you're yelling at him from the dining room to go do this or that, and you really got to get their attention. Sometimes really that eye contact, make sure they're focused, because again, their brain sort of is hearing and seeing and doing all these things, and they're just not able to focus. So making sure you have their attention, state your message clearly, ask very simple, answerable questions. This comes up with things like, what do you want for dinner? And this is one we struggle with at my house all the time. I don't know, nobody knows what. But a lot of times families will be like, she never knows if she's hungry, she never knows what she wants to eat, but decision making can be very difficult for these folks. And so again, they're thinking, you go to a restaurant and you look at that menu and it's so overwhelming, there's so many choices. A healthy brain will look at that menu and say, well, we had pasta last night and I don't really care for seafood, and you start kind of narrowing it down. Their brain looks at it and it's like, oh my gosh, all those things are an option. So as a care partner, somebody sitting there, you say, hey, I'm getting the cheeseburger. Does that sound good? Or you usually get the steak. You gonna have that tonight? Help their brain kind of narrow things down. So simple, answerable questions. The more simplified you can make it, the better, because that decision making often becomes very challenging. And similarly, break things down into steps. One of my favorite examples is taking a shower. I mean, the next time you get in the shower, you probably will think about this whether you want to or not, but just think about how many steps it takes. Like, you have to take your clothes off. Okay, but that's like, I've got to take my shirt, I've got to take my underwear, I've got to take my pants and each sock and my shoes, and this certain order that we all do it. Then we have to get in the shower and figure out the shower thing, and then we have to get the washcloth, and we've all forgotten the towel a few times, right? And you're standing in there going, oh no. Yeah, right? So, we really take for granted how many tiny little steps there are in every little aspect of our life. And our brains are so phenomenal at just doing this on autopilot. But when your brain's not functioning right, these things can be incredibly difficult for folks to get through. Next slide, please. I always like to put a plug in for one of my favorite folks. This is Teepa Snow. She is an occupational therapist by training, but she has developed some wonderful, wonderful education materials on dementia, on the stages of the disease, on how to interact with patients. She's got lots of good videos online. She's got a Facebook group. So I would highly, highly encourage you to check out her website and her material. There's never been anything she's said or I've seen her do that I kind of cringed at her. I mean, it's always very in line with what we teach as well. She's got a great podcast that are like 5 or 6 minute little mini episodes, which are great. Next slide. So some of the behavior changes, we want to speak a little bit more specifically about some of the things that we see. We often will see irritability as one of the primary things, and this triggers from kind of a lot of different areas. Oftentimes it's sort of this reactive agitation, like, they're perfectly fine 1 minute and then they fly off the handle about something, or, it really wasn't that big of a deal, or, they snap easily. We hear that a lot. We get some verbal and physical aggression, of course, but that isn't quite as common as I think sometimes people think. But it's that short temper, that mood swing. We hear a lot of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde kind of ups and downs with the irritability. And that stems a lot from, patients just not being as in control of their life and not necessarily knowing what they're supposed to be doing and who I'm constantly having to, my wife is sort of my point person, and she gets irritated with me when I keep asking her because I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to be doing. And so there's this constant sort of tension at times in the household that they really feel frustrated with. And certainly when folks are earlier in the disease and they may have some insight into their challenges and difficulty, it can be really frustrating to know I could always put together, furniture with no problem, and here it is taking me 3 hours to do this very basic thing, and I just don't understand why I can't figure this out. So irritability is a common one kind of throughout the lifespan of the disease process. Anxiousness, we see a lot of kind of excessive worrying or what we call anticipatory anxiety. So that's when we've got something coming up, we've got some appointment, and we're, what time are we going? Or, a lot of times I'll hear, well, I told mom the appointment was at 11 and she called at 7 a.m. and said she was ready to go. And I kind of, that one is, I equate to, I'm a timely person, like I'm not usually somebody that's late. And so if I knew I had somewhere to be, but I wasn't quite sure when or where or what or how long it was going to take me to get ready, I would probably be anxious about that too. And the other part of that is that a lot of times their sense of time is very skewed. So they don't really recognize it's only 7, I've got plenty of time to get ready. It's only a 10-minute ride or whatnot. So anxiety is a challenge at times for our patients, just that kind of worrying and what are we supposed to be doing today kind of thing. Apathy can be a tough one too for folks, and this is a tough one for caregivers because patients oftentimes become very flat. They're kind of content to just sit and watch TV. We see this a little bit more in vascular dementia, depending on where in the brain the damage has been done. But, they're not depressed. It's not that they're sad or tearful or, any of that. It's more just they don't want to do much of anything. They'd rather sit there. In some of our behavioral variant frontotemporal dementias, these people can become so apathetic that they don't bathe, shower, it just doesn't matter to them. And it can be incredibly difficult for caregivers because you're like, hey, we need to get out of the house, we got things to do, I need to keep you engaged, I'm reading all these books about how much activity you need, and let's get up and get going. One strategy that sometimes helps with a lot of behaviors is patients tend to be the most resistive to their primary caregiver. Right? So, if that's spouse or that's daughter, you're going to get kind of the most pushback. And when I think about that, that's a pretty typical human emotion, human behavior. Who have I had kind of arguments with in my life? It's kind of my husband and my mom. It's not nice to say that, right? But it's the people that you're closest with that you're most likely to kind of let it out on, right? And so it's the same thing with these patients. They're most comfortable telling you, no way, go to wherever, I'm not doing that, forget it. And if you have maybe your daughter come in, I always say, if I called my dad and said, hey, are you busy this weekend? We're working on a big landscaping project. Do you want to come down and help? He'd be like, okay, yeah, I'll be there. And if my mom asked him to do a big landscaping project this weekend, he'd be like, yeah, I don't think so. So these are long-standing relationship type things. So use that to your advantage. Have your daughter maybe ask him, or have if it's more just activity for the day, maybe have the grandkids sit and play some games. A lot of times the son-in-laws for some reason can get people to do things. So, that's okay. But we see that apathy is very tough for the primary caregiver because it's like you're constantly the one nagging them to do something, to get up, let's go. And they see it as, I've got this nagging partner that won't leave me alone. And in some regards, that's accurate. So I get it. Slide change, please. So the next one, depression. We do see some depression, and that's a huge component, particularly early in both the diagnosis and kind of the workup. Sometimes just being depressed can kind of mimic some of these thinking and memory symptoms. So one of the things we do when we're evaluating a patient is really assessing their depression and whether, if they have it, is it managed. Sometimes we'll tell folks like, hey, we're gonna get you in with some therapy, we're gonna start you on an antidepressant, and then we're gonna recheck some of this cognitive testing in 6 months, because sometimes it goes up back into even normal range where we would have been maybe calling them mild cognitive impairment. So depression early in the disease is really, really important to make sure that we're managing well. And again, it sort of depends on how much insight the patient has into their issues and what's going on as to whether they're having depression just because, hey, I've been diagnosed with dementia and it's depressing, But if they don't really recognize that they have anything wrong, oftentimes that's not the case. Paranoia and delusions and hallucinations, these are all these sort of psychotic symptoms, and they can be incredibly difficult. Not every patient gets them, and I think that's a kind of a scary sort of misnomer in the world of dementia, is that everybody's going to be seeing things hanging on the walls, and everybody's going to be thinking people stole from them, and it doesn't always happen. A lot of times there is sort of this accusation, suspicious of others. A lot of times it's like they think they're always talking about me, everybody's talking about me behind my back, and a lot of times that one's rooted in truth, right? Like, I am talking to my daughter about him and he's in the other room, or the kids are talking about me, or so sometimes that's not, they tend to think it's more than what it is, but there oftentimes is people talking about them. So people are stealing from them or taking from them. This one, I always say, I keep my purse when I'm in clinic in this same cupboard in a drawer, and it's my work bag. And if at the end of my clinic day I went and I opened that drawer and it wasn't there, my absolute first instinct would be someone stole my purse. And that's human nature, right? If I had not recalled that, I put it in this other cupboard, or I put it over here this morning, if I had forgotten that I personally moved it for whatever reason, your first instinct is somebody stole it. So that's kind of a reasonable thing. A lot of times they're putting things in weird places, or they're misplacing them, and they've forgotten that they've moved it, and they get defensive if you say, well, maybe you moved it somewhere. So, is it true paranoia that somebody's stealing from them? I mean, it's rooted in a little bit of that, but a lot of times it's more like they're misplacing things and can't find them. My patient the other day, her daughter found her hearing aids, and it was kind of a miracle that she found them in the oatmeal container. And who knows why they were in there, but she luckily had poured out to make some oatmeal, and clunk, clunk, there they were. Hearing aids end up in lots of strange places. The smaller they get, which is great technologically, but really hard to find. I actually kind of like the bigger ones, but I know the patients don't tend to like them. So one of the most challenging kind of paranoias that we sometimes see is that the spouse is having an affair. And this is a really tough one, and often when the spouse caregivers don't bring up to me, I sort of ask it of them, and it's not super common, but it does happen, and it's very tough. Oftentimes people have been faithful for 60 years. Where is this coming from? And so I don't know if we all sort of have a little bit of fear of that, or where that's coming from inside our deep brains. But it's not a super common thing, but we do see that sometimes, and it's a tough one to handle because you can't just kind of go along with it. Oh, yep, I am. Sorry. It doesn't really go over well. Whereas some of the other stuff you can kind of skirt around a little bit better. Delusions, from a definition standpoint, a delusion is like a fixed false belief. So hallucinations are more when you're actually seeing something that isn't there, or you're hearing somebody that's in the house that's not there. Delusions, by definition, are more kind of this thought, and paranoia kind of falls under delusions. So it's this idea that, I had a patient that for years she thought she lived in an assisted living, and the neighbor lady in her apartment had a cat. And for years, she thought the cat was trying to seduce her. And it was totally random and bizarre, and, where did this come from? Who knows? At first, her daughter was like, this is crazy, we can't handle this, we've got to do something. But the reality was she wasn't really that upset about it. It was just sort of something she'd state from time to time. And so, is that really warranting giving her some medication? No, not really. So, for years we sort of dealt with this cat, and when it would walk by, she'd kind of give it the side eye and walk back into her apartment or whatever. But then it got to be where she daily was kind of obsessing over this delusion about this cat, and it was really upsetting her. And she even, the one day in the clinic with me, the daughter brought up the cat thing again, and oftentimes I try to separate the patient from the caregiver before we get into some of these conversations, but daughter was really adamant about the cat thing. And the patient looked at me and she goes, I told him I am too old to have your kittens, would you just leave me alone? And I mean, and the thing is, you can't help but chuckle, right? But that is as real to her as it is crazy to us, right? And so, at some point we did end up using some medications when it became so upsetting to her that she was in angst about this. It's similarly with hallucinations. Sometimes our patients will see children or see animals, and they're really not upsetting or bothersome to them. They're just sort of there. So it's oftentimes, again, sort of training caregiver and family to how do you react to that? How do you respond to that? How do you not get yourself too worked up about that and kind of moving it on and letting it go? But just from a definition standpoint, hallucinations are when you actually see or hear something that's not there. It's more of a sensory feeling, versus delusions are more just kind of bizarre thoughts that are mixed up. Sometimes we see a lot of what we call confabulation, which is a little bit of a delusion, but it's more like the memories are just kind of mixed up. Like some parts are sort of real and some aren't. Maybe some of it was what somebody was watching on TV, or they're mixing up. They've been watching the Olympics, and so then they're telling daughter, well, don't you remember when your Uncle Bob was in the Olympics? Nope, he was never in the Olympics. But for whatever reason, maybe mom talked to her brother Bob, and while she was watching the Olympics, and for some reason now the brain is connected those two things. So confabulations are sometimes interesting in that they're kind of they're rooted in, there's some truth in there, but the brain just kind of fills in the blanks. So next slide, repetitive behaviors we see, sometimes this restless pacing, gotta go, rummaging through drawers, can't sit still, pacing. Again, sometimes that tends to be those people that were always busybodies. I often will ask, what was your personality like before? And it's almost always the ones that were like my mother, who just doesn't sit down for, more than a few minutes. And so, but can be really bothersome, particularly for caregivers who, like, by the end of the day, you're ready to sit down and kick your feet up, and they're like ramping to go, pacing around the house, won't sit still. They're moving things around where you just sat them down. And, so again, kind of a very stressful behavior for caregivers. Sleep issues is probably the number one most stressful issue for caregivers. Probably one of the main reasons folks make that decision to move their loved one into a facility at times. Because as a mom of twins who were terrible sleepers and had lots of issues, and I truly slept like a total of 3 hours a night cumulative for like 8 months, I can attest to how much sleep deprivation impacts your ability to function, and it's not good. And that's one thing when you're 33 with twin newborns. It's another thing when you're 75 or 80 and your husband's getting you up 4 times a night to look for his keys or to go out the front door or whatnot. And so sleep issues can be a very, very challenging behavior for families to deal with, because the caregiver needs sleep. Sometimes we'll see some vivid dreams and acting out dreams in their sleep. That's particularly common in dementia with Lewy body. And so sometimes people say, yeah, I sleep in the other room because he's yelling or kicking or moving around so much. Sundowning is sort of this phenomena. People say, oh, she's got sundowners. Well, it's not really like a diagnosis. It's just sort of something that happens where these behaviors, any and all of them, can get worse as the day wears on. So people will tell me it's like clockwork. 4:30, 5 o'clock, man, things start going downhill. She'll be fine all day, and then 4 o'clock she starts asking about going home or when's her mom coming to get her. And so we don't know entirely in the brain why things get worse by the end of the day. There's some philosophy that the brain's kind of wore out and is exhausted. We sometimes see it in patients when they've had really busy days and maybe they're exhausted, or also kind of the flip side of that, when they've been bored all day, have nothing to do, and now they're getting needing some stimulation at the end of the day. So sundowning can be oftentimes when we do medications, we kind of target them strategically with a timing, kind of a mid-afternoon dose to help kind of calm down some of that evening stuff. So again, how do we respond? Focus on feelings, not facts. This is probably my one take home for everybody is, if I see you're upset, Mom, I can see where that would be really bothersome for you. I'll try to look into that tomorrow. The banks aren't open, so let me give them a call in the morning. And right now, why don't we go? I just brought home some really good ice cream and I wanted to share it with you. So some of that kind of acknowledging the feeling. We're not trying to prove to them constantly over and over and over, proving and making them agree that they're seeing the truth. That's not really how this works. Their ability to rationalize is very limited. So don't argue, don't challenge them, don't constantly get into these kind of mindless arguments, when a lot of your philosophy kind of has to be, what difference does it make? If you went to Wendy's I use this example all the time because it'll stick in my head forever. But years ago, I had a husband and wife. The wife was the patient, and they literally got in like a screaming argument in the exam room because she was saying they ate at Wendy's and he was saying they ate at McDonald's the night before. And I was like, time out, whoa, like we gotta talk. Like if this is how it is in front of me, I don't know what it's like at home. And so I think we do have to stop back and think, what difference does it make? If he thinks we ate at Wendy's and it doesn't matter. I'm just surprised she got hamburgers. Like they were somewhere in the right realm, right? So a lot of learn to let it go and pick your battles and that kind of thing. I do tell folks to use what we call therapeutic fibbing. So it's not like make up, a lot of people are like ethically against this. It's not like make up some super crazy story, right? But if Mom's upset because, where's my dad? I haven't seen my dad in a while. You don't keep going, Mom, your dad died 25 years ago. Like if you learned every single day or multiple times a day that your parent has been dead for 25 years and you had no idea, that's really upsetting over and over. So it's often better to say, yeah, we haven't seen him in a while. I'll have to try to give him a call tomorrow. Or, again, you're not making up some big, huge, elaborate scheme, but you're just acknowledging the feeling and not focusing so much on the factual aspect of it. So, like I said, learn to let it go. Sometimes it's, don't take this stuff personally, and that, again, is a lot easier said than done, and it's easier to do when your stress is not sky high as a caregiver. A lot of direction and redistraction, and then maintaining routine really does help our patients. I think routine's pretty good for all of us. I'll be very happy to get back on school routine starting next Thursday. As much as I love my babies and love having them in the summer, it is just a whole different world. So, routine is good for all of us, and particularly our patients, because if you think about it, the brain has to do less work. Like if you're always kind of in the pretty similar pattern to your day, your brain doesn't have to really think about it. It's just sort of ingrained. Next slide. This keeps shutting off. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about some of the commonly used medications. And like I said, I can talk for hours and hours on any of this. But historically, for many years, we've sort of had these 4 pills, oral pills that we've had that are FDA approved for Alzheimer's disease, and we do use them and borrow them for other types of dementia, and we call them cognitive enhancing medications. And the big thing with them are they don't treat the underlying disease. So that bad protein that I talked about earlier is still building up. The way I say it is, if you've got lung cancer and you're having shortness of breath and trouble breathing, it might give you an inhaler and you breathe better, and therefore your quality of life is a little better and your ability to function is better, but it ain't doing nothing for the underlying lung cancer. So that's how these medicines are. They're designed to just try to help those brain cells to work a little bit better, maybe work a little bit longer, for as long as they can. So they're not perfect medications. You will still see decline, but we can sort of, slow the functional decline down. So they may be able to hold on to their ability to, use the phone and dial out. And I say, like, early in the disease, these medicines may be helping mom to be able to get in the car and go to the grocery store and get what she needs. And maybe she's able to hold on to that skill a little bit longer. The disease progresses, and in middle stages, okay, maybe she's still able to get in the shower and do her showering more independently than she would have if she hadn't been on them. And then later in the disease, it's more like, okay, still conversing, still interacting, maybe a little longer than what she would have without them. So the big thing, though, is that they don't treat the underlying disease. Now, in some ways, that can be a good thing because we borrow them for other types of dementia. So we aren't just using them necessarily for Alzheimer's disease because they're cognitive enhancers. So sometimes we will use them in other types of dementia. Not always, but sometimes. So there's 2 main drug classes of these, and the first one is cholinesterase inhibitors. And you may have heard of these: Aricept, which the generic is donepezil, Exelon, which the generic is rivastigmine, and Razidine, which the generic is galantamine. They all work very similarly and pretty equal as far as efficacy, and they work by increasing acetylcholine in the brain, is kind of the chemical that we know tends to be low in folks with dementia. They have a lot of GI side effects or stomach upset kind of stuff, so diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, loss of appetite, weight loss. So, when we increase acetylcholine in the brain, it gets increased everywhere, and your gut tends to be a little sensitive to that. So some people can tolerate one much better than another. If you've been tried on one and it doesn't work well, it's still reasonable to try, and by not work well, I mean you have side effects. It's reasonable to try one of the others. It's interesting to me, sometimes people have violent vomiting on one and do perfectly fine on another. They all come in pill form, but the rivastigmine also comes in a patch, which can be handy at times for a lot of reasons. Sometimes it's a little glitchy with insurance. So those are the cholinesterase inhibitors. And then the next drug class is called NMDA receptors, and it just has one happy little medicine called memantine, and it works more on glutamate, which is another neurochemical in the brain. Usually pretty well tolerated. It's got some little quirks sometimes, but there is like an immediate release and an extended release, and then the pharmaceutical companies got really creative and made something called Namzaric, which is a combination of donepezil and memantine. It's nice, but it tends to be pretty expensive, and just having 2 separate prescriptions often is much more affordable for folks, so we don't use it a ton. So historically, for many, many years, we kind of had these 4 meds, and the goal was typically to get folks on one of those 3, depending on tolerability and insurance coverage, and then sort of eventually add on memantine, and that's, not the procedure we do for everybody, but a lot of people, that was kind of the philosophy. But then we now have, and so these new fancy meds, and we were involved in all of the trials for all of these at OSU, and we've been extensively involved in lots and lots of trials for many different MABs, which are monoclonal antibodies, so they all end in MAB. And we laugh because we were in bapineuzumab and aducanumab and lecanemab and donanemab, and it sounds like we're speaking a different language, and they just keep getting longer and longer. But the first one was approved a couple of years ago. That one is no longer on the market. Not because it was like a major problem, it's just the newer ones are a little bit better, and so there wasn't a huge advantage to those. Lecanemab the brand name is Leqembi, and then donanemab was just approved a few weeks ago. It's called Kisunla. And all three of these were approved while I was on beach vacations each year, and it's become quite the joke. And so if anybody needs a drug approved, please feel free to send me to the ocean. But it literally was like, I'm like, guys, I'm going on vacation next week. We knew donanemab was getting close, right? And so it was comical because it got the approval, and I kept getting texts like, you did it again. So it's fun, except that like a whole lot of stuff happens real quickly once that approval goes through, and so we get into like chaos mode. These medicines are very good at getting rid of the amyloid in the brain. So going back to that protein that builds up in the brain in folks that have Alzheimer's disease. So the drugs are really good at getting rid of amyloid. We know they're good at that. And these drugs were pretty good. One of the failures of this drug class in previous drugs and previous studies was that, okay, they're really good at getting rid of amyloid, but how does that impact your data? Does that actually improve your clinical functioning? And so these drugs in studies did show enough clinical benefit that they, were statistically significant enough to get FDA approval. And so they do show a slowing in the rate of decline. So you still get worse, but you don't get as worse as quick. Now, they're very, very limited in who can get these drugs, and this is a challenge for us in the clinic because, we kind of anticipated that everybody and their brother was going to want on these medicines, and it's kind of been like that. But they're for very, very, very early stages of the disease. In fact, they're being studied now in patients who have positive biomarkers but don't have any symptoms. And so we're really, the idea is, can we prevent the damage before it's done? Once the damage is done to those brain cells, it's kind of already, the ship has sailed, unfortunately. So a lot of times patients that get to us with, the intention of getting on these new drugs, we unfortunately have to tell them they're not for you for a variety of reasons. They do require proof of amyloid in the brain. If we're going to take it away, we got to prove that you've got too much in there in the first place. And currently, the way we do that is either by a spinal tap or an amyloid PET scan. Amyloid PET scans are technically covered by Medicare, but the reimbursement is like yay big, and the cost to the hospital is like yay big, and so many hospitals are like, yeah, we're not going to offer that until Medicare figures out how to pay us back a little bit more for it. And so there's a lot of challenges in getting amyloid PET scans. Spinal taps, of course, people are kind of into that or not. I do multiple spinal taps a week. It's not that bad, but I understand why that can be a barrier to people getting it as well. They are infusion medications. One's every other week, one's once a month. That's a lot of commitment, that's a lot of time, that's a lot of effort. So that can be kind of a turnoff for some folks. So there's lots and lots of considerations. There's some significant side effects we have to talk about with folks. So these drugs have really become a huge component of our clinical practice, and just having these conversations, it takes a lot of time. And so this is a huge part of our world, and it's good in that we finally have something else to offer some people, right? So there's a little bit of hope. And I often tell folks, the very first med that came out for MS, or the very first med that came out for various cancers, they're not the ones that we use necessarily today, but they sort of paved the road. And so that's kind of where we're at with some of these new meds, is that eventually this is going to be a little bit more available to the world, and maybe be better fine-tuned, and be better meds that don't have quite the risk. I should mention too, there's a lot of talk in the news about blood-based biomarkers, so you can get a blood test. None of those are currently FDA approved yet. There's a bunch of them out there and kind of available. I anticipate that may I definitely anticipate that one of them will get approved, but what we anticipate is more like that can be used a little bit more as a screening tool. So maybe you see your primary care provider, and either you're seeing some issues or your family's seeing some issues, issues, so they can get that blood test, and it kind of looks at what is your amyloid level and sort of predicts what it would be if we went on and then did the spinal tap or the amyloid PET scan. So, probably in the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see that more routinely used. Next slide. And so then we talk a little bit about research. At OSU, we do lots and lots and lots of research in Alzheimer's and related dementias. And so we've got studies for Alzheimer's, we have studies for mild cognitive impairment, we have studies for completely normal people, what we call, clinically normal, Huntington's disease, dementia with Lewy body, frontotemporal dementia. We've got lots and lots of studies. And I really do encourage folks, if you're, at all inclined to be interested, a lot of times we do want you to have some sort of a diagnosis. We don't want you coming through the research path just for an evaluation, but if you're pretty clear cut in what your diagnosis is based on your outside providers, oftentimes we can get you into some clinical trials. And the only way we're ever going to make a dent in any of these dementias is by generous folks who are willing to participate in research, because that's where a lot of this, all of it really, in the end, kind of comes from the generosity of those folks. So we do have a email address, cognitive@osumc.edu. That's geared predominantly toward our research stuff, so if that interests anyone, let me know. So with that, I always like to end my presentations with a couple of slides. So this one, and I know you guys can't read it, but it's Winnie the Pooh, and it says, "What day is it?" asked Pooh. "It's today," squeaked Piglet. "My favorite day," said Pooh. And I think that's the way we got to respond, right? Is even if it doesn't make a whole lot of, it's today, but that's exactly the approach. Oh, that's lovely. So I always like that one. And then next slide. This is why I do what I do. This is my grandpa Kovesci, and this is he and I, my junior year of high school at our senior citizens prom. And he died of dementia 6 months after I started at OSU in 2010. And he showed me a lot, and our family was blessed to be a very rare family now that I've done this for so many years, that really got along really well, and for the most part. And everybody kind of chipped in and took turns and helped my grandma and spent the night down there, and they had a rotation between my dad and his siblings. But what I saw of that being, in college at the time, and my brother being a little younger than me and still at home, was how much that, just my dad being gone 2 to 3 nights a week. My brother went off to college in the midst of it, and so all of a sudden my mom goes from a house of lots to a house of nobody, her and the dog. And just the downstream effect of all of that. And so, it's to this day still has a profound impact on us. One of the things I always like to say, and I think a lot of people don't think about it, is he had a specific type of dementia where he was pretty good, and then he was really bad, and he stayed there for 5 long, long years. And so my grandma will tell you that while that was some of the hardest years in her life, she was blessed to get to spend so much one-on-one time with her adult children. And, that's a perception to kind of think about if you are that adult child or you're that adult niece or the cousin, is that a lot of times the caregivers or even the patient themselves and being able to spend some one-on-one time, we sort of shy away from that as we get older, right? Like, I don't spend a whole lot of time one-on-one with my mom and dad. Usually my kids are there with me, or and so lots of different dynamics that I've seen at play in many, many families. But the reality is these diseases impact folks astronomically, and the community rallying is just not there the way it is when somebody has breast cancer, or we're not going on our colon cancer walks, and it just we just don't have it the way we do for some other things. And so I have a patient who says when her husband, patient's wife, who says when her husband passes away, she's writing a book and calling it Alzheimer's disease. It ain't no casserole diagnosis. And I was like, what? And she's like, it's been 6 years and nobody's brought me a casserole. And I'm like, yeah, I get it. That's true. Like, people kind of shy away from this stuff instead of rallying around, which is particularly why I'm so drawn to what you folks are doing here in this program, because as a church community, as a neighborhood community, we really do have to support each other. And for better or worse, there isn't the funding out there to, everybody in this situation to receive endless amounts of funding for respite time, or people are often very shocked when we tell them that assisted living isn't covered by Medicare. They're like, wait, what am I supposed to do with her now? And it's like, well, so I think these types of community grassroots programs are really, really valuable. So I'm happy to entertain questions. I know we do have to move on to the other presenters, so you let me know when you're ready.
So, Dad has passed away several years ago. The question comes up, he hasn't called me lately. And my technique to go at that is say, well, what did you want to ask him about? And I begin with probing questions. Is that upsetting? Is that a good idea?
It depends on how they react, and I think I often tell folks, like, if you had a really rough day or a really rough episode, get out a piece of paper and kind of write down, like, what did I say? What did I do? And if it worked really well, then yeah, use it. Like, that's cool. If it upsets them, don't do it the next time. Come up with a different strategy. And so for some folks, they maybe like to, you may angle it a little bit more of reminiscing a little bit, kind of like, oh yeah, when we were kids, a lot of times their long-term memory is very, very sharp. So breaking out the old photo albums, or remember that trip to Daytona we took when I was 7, and kind of shifting that conversation. Or, I always admired how much Dad worked, even though I know he wasn't home around a lot, just something to kind of shift that conversation a little bit. But reminiscing can be a really good tactic at times, because that long-term memory is usually pretty good.
Just another quick one. Mother, who is now going into dementia, has had a habit all of her life of having a glass of wine at dinner. So it's not a problem that there's a lot of wine in the refrigerator.
It depends. Does she keep it to 1 glass?
How do you do that?
Yeah. You have to limit what they have access to. And so that's easier said than done. Maybe buy smaller bottles or those kinds of things.
Even 1 glass of wine detrimental to?
No, I think if somebody who's always had that, if you've always had kind of your 5 o'clock cocktail or something, I'm okay with a little bit of alcohol. The challenge is often that they forget they've already had it. And so now they're on 2 or 3 or 4. And we see this even with soda or cookies or whatever. I have one lady who buys her mom one of those Worthman's chocolate, a gigantic box of chocolates every year for Valentine's Day, and has for many, many years. And she came in and she said, can you believe she ate the whole thing in 24 hours? And I'm like, yeah, I can, because I could do it too. If I didn't have the sense of, oh my gosh, I've already had 3 pieces, that's enough, hold back, Renee. And if you don't remember, so they lose sort of that awareness. So a lot of times when it comes to, people saying she drank a whole case of pop in, one day, you really do have to limit what they have access to. So I'll say put 2 or 3 cans of Pepsi in the fridge, put the rest in a tub in the garage or the basement, and when they're all gone, say, well, gosh, I'm sorry, I'll have to get some more at the store when I'm there this week, or I'll go later today. And then the next day so you can't really blame them, because if I had no self-awareness, I would eat that whole darn box of chocolates myself. Some of us have better self-control than others from the get-go. I am not one of those people. So, but yeah, you do, and the alcohol can be a real challenge at times. Sometimes we've had folks that water down wine or liquor a little bit at a time, just to kind of, or even mix into the bottle like non-alcoholic, or, get kind of creative sometimes behind the scenes, because I get it. If you've had your glass of wine every night for dinner, don't try to take it away. They're pretty attached to it, I get it.
I had a question.
Yeah.
There's like apps out there now that say, hey, do this memory app. It can delay or protect you from getting Alzheimer. Is there any truth to that?
There's not a lot of good science. I mean, what I would say is there's good science behind keeping your mind busy, right? So the patients that kind of just sit on the couch and vegetate all day, I see them declining faster than people who are active and engaged either in their community, or maybe it's, you know, even just like social outings. I had one lady who was really involved in like a flower arranging club for years, and so that really kept her. She did it every Tuesday, you know, or, you know, these activities, this kind of brain stimulation. If people are very early in the disease, there's some cognitive like therapy type programs that you can do. You know, there's not a lot, but I think just trying to keep the wheels turning as best you can. And I like to say, you know, challenge your brain. If you've always been an avid reader, that's great. Reading's still good. But maybe try, like, go to the zoo and actually walk around and read and kind of think and talk about one another and say, oh gosh, do you remember when we went on that safari many, many years ago in Africa and we saw this? You know, it's so connecting, kind of reading with learning, with thinking, with connection. You know, all the Sudokus, the crosswords, all of that, I mean, it's great, but if it was something you never ever did before, it might be kind of hard to take up. I hate Sudoku. I'm very math-minded, and I do not like it. So, you know, God help me, please, if my husband starts shoving those at me someday in my later years if I get confused, because I just don't like them. So, you know, a lot of times, particularly our gentlemen, families will say, well, he never really had any hobbies. He worked, he came home, he didn't cook, he didn't clean. So, you know, you got to kind of find sometimes some things. So there are some app-based, you know, a few of my patients have said they subscribe to like the Luminosity. I don't have any science backing that up, but I think anything that kind of keeps your brain active and doing things. The tablets are nice because you can play games, solitaire if you're tech savvy a little bit, but good old cards and playing solitaire with cards and things are great too. Board games are good. Sometimes as the disease progresses, we have to kind of go back to maybe like Uno or Old Maid or Go Fish, and that's when the, you know, teenage grandkids can be really helpful sometimes to rope them in. But yeah, active brains are much better than sitting around staring at the TV brains.
I have heard that there are some new medications out that are $26,000 or $28,000 a year. Based on what you know of previous medication travels, how soon would it be that those amounts will be going down?
Well, those are the ones I talked about. So those are our new meds. They're expensive drugs, just like any new drug for cancer or MS or whatever. They're going to be expensive. As somebody who's worked in research for 15 years, I now kind of see why they're so expensive, because it's taken us 15 years of massive amounts of research to get to these drugs. So I get where the pharmaceutical companies have to kind of recoup some of that. But, you know, the price will eventually go down as the demand goes up. But again, these are for a very kind of finite small group of patients at this standpoint that are just very, very early. Medicare does cover the drugs, and so, you know, traditional Medicare covers them. We aren't even having to do authorizations at this point. Some of the Advantage plans are a little sticky and require a lot more from us to get them covered. Some of the younger patients who still have private insurance, it's a little bit harder to get them, but Medicare is covering them. So, you know, it's not perfect, but they aren't cheap.
Any other questions before we move on? Okay.
So one thing you mentioned was physical environment and how important that is. You mentioned kind of the Pepsi, Coke, some of those ideas. What are some other good changes to physical environments that might help people struggling with dementia?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a lot of it sort of depends on where they're at in the stage in the disease. So, you know, early on, some of the more environmental things may not make a huge difference. But if, you know, a lot of the safety stuff, so if people are having some more, like dementia with Lewy bodies is sort of similar to a Parkinsonism type disease. So they get a lot of shuffling, they get a lot of balance issues. So, you know, all of your typical pick up your throw rugs don't have a lot of extra furniture or stuff laying around. So that sort of safety environmental stuff is important. But from a behavioral and like cognition standpoint, as the disease progresses, you know, particularly in the later stages, we will have patients who see themselves in the mirror and get upset and either talk to themselves and have a pleasant conversation, or they see this old man in the mirror and who's that guy in my house? And that can be upsetting. And so sometimes we'll say, get rid of the mirrors, or close the windows, because that reflection sometimes can trigger some of that. Again, their sense of time is really skewed, not just for like the minute, but in years. And so a lot of times they'll look at wife and say, you're my daughter, and no, I'm your wife, but maybe she kind of looks like your daughter did years, So we get that when they see their own reflection sometimes, like, I can't be me, who's that old guy? I just had a patient the other day whose daughter was like, we were just at this family wedding, and I was showing, the pictures came back from, I think it was their daughter's wedding, and she's like, I'm showing mom, and she's like, who's that? She goes, that's you, but they don't see themselves in this like gray, older hair kind of, look. So sometimes watching, your mirrors, your reflective type surfaces, the less clutter, the better. I think that's probably for all of us. It kind of helps our brains to not. One thing that I like to tell folks, even kind of earlier in the disease, is going back to like that decision-making aspect. So when people will say, she's wearing the same clothes over and over again. Well, sometimes it's, you go in that closet, and I don't know about others, but I got a closet full of clothes that I don't wear. I'd say 90% of them I don't wear much. And so my brain kind of is like, those don't fit. Those don't, they're not seasonally appropriate. And so let's fall back on these, 5 or whatever. And so our brains can kind of look at that. So one thing folks can do in like the closet, or, again, with that decision-making challenge is limit their options, so you don't have to get rid of it. You don't have to donate it. Just get it out of sight for a little while. So if it's Christmas sweaters, we really don't need those out right now. It's really hot, and we see patients a lot of times that have, not appropriate weather, which it could potentially put them at harm. It's hot out there. So if you're out walking around in 2 sweaters, now if you don't have access to those sweaters, you might pick up the t-shirt that might be more appropriate. So trying to kind of limit, I had one gentleman, and I just love them. They were a young onset family who was really young, and they lived in the country and had horses, and she always wore her Wranglers and her belt and her buckle. She was a horse person. But man, the fine motor skills to get those tight jeans up and get them buttoned and that belt for, and her husband and her would kind of bicker and argue, and he'd try to yank them up and she'd get mad, and it was a whole thing. And, I was like, listen, leggings are in style, it was like stretch pants, it's the way to go. And it took me a while, because he was looking at it as this, she would always want to wear these, and yes, but at this stage, maybe let's try something different. Another thing that we talk a lot about later in the disease is, changing your clothes twice a day to get dressed in the morning, and then you have to put your pajamas or your nightgown on at night. I mean, do we really? Let's go for like a 24-hour loop instead. A lot of times our patients are wearing more like comfy clothes on, they're stretched, they're comfortable, they're elastic, maybe a t-shirt and slacks, or, so maybe they sleep in it and then we get dressed in the morning, or vice versa. Maybe we put our fresh clothes on at night and then we wear them all the next day. And that eliminates, it sounds kind of weird if you're not used to that, but if every day, twice a day, you're having a really big fight about changing clothes, you're cutting those fights down by 50%, which is a pretty good return on that change, right? And if you're just staying home or wherever, it probably doesn't really matter what she has on. So again, pick your battles. But those are some of the environmental things. The closet thing is a big one. I had one guy recently, and I was so excited. She was really struggling with socks. Every day it was like a big thing for her to figure out what socks went, and she'd mix them all up, she'd take them apart. It was a whole thing. And so he got rid of all the socks, went out and bought 10 pairs of dark gray socks, because he said they can go with navy blue slacks, they can go with black slacks. He had a whole plan. And, she adjusted pretty well to that, Another one can be, moving into wearing Depends. That can be a real challenge. So sometimes we'll, less options in the underwear drawer, and maybe you start out, instead of the big diaper-looking Depends, we splurge a little bit and get these nice fancy new ones that look a lot like panties, and we put those in the drawer, and slowly you just don't have the option of wearing regular underwear anymore. Again, these are general recommendations. They certainly don't work for everybody, but it's just a mindset to be thinking of how can I alter their environment to set them up for success. Because you know what? If I lay out outfits or I limit them to 5 shirts and 5 pants that all kind of intermingle, it's actually popular right now. It's called a capsule wardrobe. It's all over TikTok and things, where you can just mix up, like if I wear this same skirt with this, shirt and switch the so it's all the rage. But that gives them a sense of I can still get dressed. It may give them that ability to hold on to those skills longer if we just kind of create the environment that best supports them. So it's not always kind of like the pick up the throw rugs and install the grab bars, which are important, but it's kind of sometimes thinking outside of the box with some of these other things as well. So,
would you thank Renee for her time?
Thank you again.
Thank you so much. It was so helpful. Both my grandmother and my wife's grandmother both passed away of dementia, and I was thinking, if we should have done this, if we could have done this. So thank you for that. I'm Jason. I'm privileged to serve here as the senior pastor, and have been really excited about this new ministry, and not only for what it means for us as a congregation, but the way in which we can come alongside people beyond our walls in our community. So I want to spend really quickly a few moments kind of talking about the spirituality of dementia, and particularly why we believe this is something we as a church should be a part of. I am going to come at it from a Christian perspective. That is who we are as a congregation. But if you are not a part of our church community, you're not a part of a Christian community, I believe you'll be able to take some takeaways as well, because dementia impacts everybody of every faith tradition. So I want to look at this really quickly through 3 lenses or 3 threads. When we're thinking about this ministry, we're really coming at it from these kind of 3 groups of people, 3 threads. There's the participant, which is the primary person that we're really coming alongside. Then there's the caregiver component as well, the caregiver thread. And then the third thread is the faith community. What is our response to those who live with dementia or other cognitive impairments? And this really was born out of some questions as a congregation that we began to ask. 2 years ago, we kind of set for us as a church kind of a 2-year plan. We call it, these 2 years have been our all-in plan. And it was based around Jesus' words of this invitation for us to love God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. And so we began to ask ourselves, what does it mean to love God with our mind? And I think many of us could answer that question pretty easily. We are people of cognitive abilities. We love God through our faith, which is reading and engaging in Scripture and other kind of cognitive things. But it raised some questions for us as a pastoral ministry and congregational care team of what does it mean to love God with your mind if you are experiencing cognitive decline? And that really stopped us for a moment, because we had to stop and go, we don't necessarily know. How do you love God if your mind is beginning to experience some sort of decline? So I want to begin with looking at the first thread, which are the participants. Much of our faith, as I said, is a mental or cognitive expression. Just think about if you are a part of a faith community, how much in just a worship service you use your mind. You read. In our congregation, we'll often say, turn to this passage of Scripture, and we'll put the page number in the little pew Bible in the pew, and we'll say, turn to, Mark chapter 10, verse 9, and it's on page 740. You're using your mind in that cognitive exercise of reading and engaging Scripture. We're taught to memorize Scriptures. Well, if you are one who's experiencing cognitive decline, memorization is extremely difficult. Much of who we understand God to be is a cognitive expression. Theology is a cognitive exercise. What we say and how we articulate and understand God. Think about the way we participate in worship, in singing songs. That means we have to tap into parts of our mind to remember the words or be able to read the words on the screen or in the hymnal. And then on top of that, there are the things that we get to participate in worship or in the life of any faith community. Participating on a committee, leading a committee, working on missions. And so what often happens is for those who are experiencing some sort of cognitive decline is they're no longer able to participate at the level that they used to be able to participate in. If you've ever experienced an illness of any sort, or you've had a surgery and you've had to stop what you previously did in the faith community, there's a grieving that goes along with that when you're unable to do that which you were used to be able to do. And this often in the church or in any faith community leads to a deep sense of isolation because a person or even the caregiver no longer feels comfortable being in a worshipful environment, being in a church environment, serving on a committee, serving on missions. Either the person who's experiencing the cognitive decline, when they can recognize that that's happening, or certainly the caregiver who's watching this unfold. And on top of that, we understand our faith as a communal expression. It is built upon relationships. We greet each other at the door. And when I'm in my best frame of mind on a Sunday morning and I've had, 5 or 6 cups of coffee before, and I might even remember your name when you walk in the door. But if you are somebody who's experiencing cognitive decline and you walk into an environment like we're sitting in now and you can't remember the person's name, that feels extremely isolating. And you might find yourself frustrated because you know that you know them. But you can't just put the words, the memory, the name together. And so this all leads to a loss of relationships, deep sense of isolation. And so what we often see in the church is either the person themselves, the participant, we're calling the participant those who would participate in our ministry, or the caregiver themselves slowly begin to disappear. We don't see them on Sunday mornings as frequently as we used to. And part of it is just this slow withdrawal that often happens out of fear, out of anxiety, out of embarrassment. And the second thread is the caregiver themselves. Caregivers are not observers of somebody who's experiencing memory decline. They are living it. They live it. It is a lived experience, a lived reality, as Renee articulated so well. It is something they are experiencing. They might be experiencing it differently, but it is certainly impacting their life. And so this solicits for the caregiver many emotions. Sometimes it's fear. What will my loved one's life be like? How fast will this progress? What will my future be like when my husband or wife or parent is no longer able to function as they used to? Or the feeling for the caregiver could be around anger or regret. Why didn't I spend more time with my loved one? Why didn't I spend more time with my mother? Those times where, she wanted me to pick up the phone and call her and I found 10 other things to do. Why? So there's a deep sense of regret. As a pastor, I'm privileged to come alongside people in very vulnerable parts of their life, stages of their life, and to help them make some of these spiritual connections. And in the first church that I served, I remember this family who they both recently retired. So they were in their mid-60s. And they had worked hard, both husband and wife worked extremely hard to build a certain life for themselves, and they were so looking forward to retirement. And within a few years of retiring, the husband was diagnosed with dementia and declined very quickly. And I remember having a conversation with his wife as she was asking the question, when do I put him in a care facility, which is an extremely difficult decision for families to make. And she said this to me, and I'll never remember or forget it. She was a very strong person in her faith. And she looked at me and she said, God robbed us of what was supposed to be our best years. That's a theological question or a theological statement. She was wrestling with her faith in God and her lived experience. And what was coming out of her was anger and frustration. And there might be shame or some guilt of, why did I wait so long for my loved one to be tested? Did I miss some of those early things that Renee spoke about? Or even embarrassment. If your loved one acts out in a way that's not socially acceptable or a social norm in a restaurant or in church, and you feel that, you feel every eye turn toward you and watch you or observe you. And for caregivers as well, there is a deep sense of social isolation as well. They experience, just as their loved one does, the participant, the person living with dementia or Alzheimer's, social isolation. And certainly they feel it too, as they pull back and no longer have the same relationships they had with their friends. They can't go out and play golf like they used to. They can't get together with their Bible study. They can't sing in the choir anymore, because who's going to stay home with my husband or my wife? And then there's exhaustion, as Renee spoke about. And that's a mental exhaustion, an emotional exhaustion, a physical exhaustion, and a spiritual exhaustion. And caregivers find themselves unable to participate in the communities that used to bolster them, used to give them life, used to energize them. And they find themselves lost and exhausted. And the third thread then is the faith community. What is our response to people who are experiencing cognitive decline? We believe from a theological position, particularly in the Christian tradition, that God shows preferential treatment to anyone experiencing hardship or illnesses or oppression or marginalization. I mean, Jesus seems to indicate this in Matthew 25 when he says, whatever you do to the least of these, you're doing it to me. And so the faith community, we as the faith community have to ask, what does coming alongside anybody who's experiencing some sort of hardship, but certainly in this situation, those who are experiencing cognitive decline? And so for us, it's a question of, how do we live out our call to put our faith into practice? And the only way I know to do that, the only way I think we're supposed to do that, is to mirror Jesus, who was incarnational. We believe as Christians, Jesus was God incarnate, God with human flesh on the earth, experienced life as we experience it, experienced grief, experienced death, experienced loss of relationships. And so we mirror that. We come alongside others who find themselves in difficult situations. And so what happens is, when these three threads come together, when the participant living with some sort of cognitive impairment, the caregiver and the faith community come together, we believe then a beautiful tapestry is created. This is what community looks like. This is what the church has always meant to be, is those who come together at every stage of our life, no matter what somebody is experiencing, to provide care and respite and hope and renewal. And so for our ministry is really focused on these three words: renew, refresh, and restore. That we're providing renewal, refreshment, and restoration for the participant, for the caregiver, and even for those who will participate in the ministry. For those the participants, we believe God's calling us to provide a loving and safe environment where they can practice their faith, however that might look. One of the ways we're going to do it is, once a month, we'll have a worship service. where they'll get to sing songs. And our hope and prayer is that it will, we know music often is something that those who experience dementia, Alzheimer's, and cognitive impairments can tap into music. My undergrad degree is in music, so it's a special sweet spot for me. But for people to remember the hymns of the faith and not have to be embarrassed if they forget the words, or not feel like they're standing out if they sing out of tune, or they're not standing when everybody else is standing. Once a month we plan on providing a time for worship for those who would like to participate. For the caregivers, it's to give them a break, as Renee said. I think one of the greatest spiritual disciplines in the Christian tradition is one of the most overlooked and forgotten spiritual disciplines. We do other things like pray, fast, do missions work. Here's the most overlooked, but I think the most powerful: taking a nap. Taking a nap. Even Jesus took a nap on a boat. And so to be able to provide space for a caregiver for 4 hours, once or twice a week, that they get to choose what they want to do with that time. Maybe it is taking a nap because they can get a good amount of sleep during the day. Maybe it is for them to go to their bridge club or their golf club, or to go out to a restaurant with some coworkers that they haven't been able to see for a while, or to go to the grocery store and not have to worry about where their loved one is, or are they pulling something off the shelf, are they acting in a particular way, to just be present whatever they feel need to do. We want to provide that renewal, that respite, and that care for them. And then certainly for us as a faith community, as I said, it's an opportunity for us to practice our faith, to come alongside people, to provide them hope and care and renewal. And so I'm really excited about this. Kenyetta's been working hard, our team's been working hard on this, and we really believe this is where God is calling us to go as a faith community. And so we want to show you quickly a video just to give you a very small but an accurate snapshot of what this ministry will look like, and then afterwards Kenyetta will provide us some closing words. So take a look at the screen.
Hello, and welcome to Renew, Refresh, Restore, a respite ministry of Scioto Ridge United Methodist Church. My name is Kenyetta Hardy, and I want to briefly share with you who we are and what we do. It was put on the hearts of the congregational care team on how the church could support such a rapidly growing community of individuals living with dementia. We not only wanted to support those living with dementia, but the caregiver also. After much prayer and research, we partnered with the Respite for All Foundation in Montgomery, Alabama. And thus, Renew, Refresh, Restore was born. This ministry provides a tailored approach that respects the unique experiences and abilities of each participant living with dementia, while fostering a sense of belonging and reducing social isolation. We extend a warm embrace to the caregivers navigating the challenges of dementia with their loved one, in addition to support, understanding, and companionship on this journey. The benefits of this ministry for the participant and the caregiver are: participants get to socialize in a safe and secure setting and engage in stimulating activities with trained volunteers, while caregivers can take a much-needed break to rest, run errands, or attend to their own well-being. Together, let's find solace, strength, and moments of joy during the complexities of memory loss. You're not alone. You're among friends. Thank you, Renee and Jason, for the information that was shared. I just have a couple of announcements, and then I'm going to release you. Tuesday, August 20th, we will have our volunteer training for the Respite Ministry from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Lunch will be provided, so whether you are definitive about volunteering or on the fence, I invite you to join us and come and register online. Or you can take a folder with you, take it home, and return it to the church office before the 20th of August. In an effort to build trust and a connection with the caregivers and their loved ones, we are offering our first week free. Those dates are Monday, September 9th and Wednesday, September the 11th. If one day doesn't work for you, then the option for the other is available. To my caregivers in the room and online, Renew, Refresh, Restore is asking you, just give us a try. Let us take care of your loved one for 4 fun-filled hours while you take some much-needed care for yourself. Reserve your space with a team member in the lobby, or you can register your loved one tonight. Take a participant folder home, and you can return the folders back by August the 23rd. Thank you everyone for your time. There are refreshments in the cafe, so please stop by when you leave the registration table. Again, thank you and have a good night.